Hello, welcome to another episode of Asian Mythology Retold Triggers. Today we will be discussing the basics of the God Power effects. We all know what God Powers are, but how do you get them in your scenarios? It's fairly straightforward, but there's a few things you will need to be aware of which I will cover in this video. So, with our triggers, if you go to G for God Powers, you'll see there's a few God Power effects which I'll be covering throughout this video. The God Power Grant is how we get a God Power granted to our player. So I'm just going to start off with the very basics of how to actually grant and then invoke a God Power. Let's go for Meteor, for example. So in order for a God Power to work, we need three things. First of all is we need the God Power to be granted, so the player actually has the ammo loaded as such. For invocation of the God Power, we can do this via triggers. There's a few more conditions we need to satisfy. So first of all, we need to satisfy that we've got the God Power granted, which we have. Second of all, we need line of sight to that area for pretty much every God Power. There's a few exceptions like vision, but generally you need line of sight in order to invoke it. Thirdly, you need there to be no God Power blocks in effect. So this would be things like Isis monuments or Eclipse God Powers and other God Powers in the general vicinity. You'll see all three of these are met. I've got an area, I've got line of sight to it, I've got the God Power, and there's no blocking. So when I test this scenario, you will see that the God Power Meteor will be invoked without any problems. As it's all in the same trigger, it's just a very quick grant and invoke. So grant and invoke. So there we go, we've got the Meteor swing down on poor Nick. With the God Power invoke, you might have noticed there are a few different parameters there. So what's going on? We've got a unit target and we've got two area targets. You don't have to fill all of these up, and what you use will depend on the God Power. Just think in your mind the process of what's happening when you're using this power here. Meteor is targeted to an area, so we set an area. Something like Bolt would be targeted on an enemy unit, so we select a target unit. And something like Shifting Sands, an underworld passage, has a start point and an end point, so we would select two areas. You're never going to need to use all three of these. Just think about what God Power you want to invoke, think about how you invoke it normally, and then be guided by these settings that you've come up with here. It's also possible for us to modify God Power data. So in this example, I've got some enemies here. I can grant myself one use of the Bolt God Power. I can specify whether I want it repeatable at the end, so that will use the cost system, and then this one will specify, as I've said before, if it's a free use or not. I can use the cost in this example. If we are specifying cost and the timing cooldown, you usually have to loop these conditions, otherwise God Power data can reset, at least I've found in my testing. If we then go in here, we can set the cooldown for Bolt to 2 seconds, and we can set the cost for the Bolt God Power as well. So we could say set it to 5 and then set it to 10. The repeat cost is what happens, it increases every time it's used, so it will go 5, 15, 25, 35, etc. Let's show you that in action. So I've got my one God Power that was granted for free. After 2 seconds I can use for 5, then for 15, then for 25, and then 35, and so on, and it's going to keep going on like that until you run out of it. If I do the exact same trigger setup, but when I'm granting my God Power I elect to not use cost, then player 1 will have access to the God Power. It's still initially free, and then it will still cost 5. So again, there's still a few things with these effects to work out. They're not perfect, they don't describe exactly what they do, unfortunately, so sometimes you do need a bit of trial and error for this approach. Other God Power conditions that we've got, you've got your army triggers, so you can use the army as a target for targets God Powers, but again remember it's got to be a valid unit target God Power like Bolt rather than Shifting Sands, and there's got to be enough of the God Power, no blocking and line of sight. God power remove will just clear all God powers a player has, so it will essentially wipe out all God powers and then you can fill them up again. God power enable blocking. This is a toggle which enables or disables the blocking ability. So if we have this off, it means we could invoke lots of meteors at once in one spot, and I'll just show you what that one looks like because that's always quite fun to do. So this means God power blockers such as ISIS monuments and God power blockers won't work, and you can just spam loads of God powers in the same place, and that can sometimes give you some quite fun effects or some rather crazy maps. There's one more effect that you might have noticed in here, and I'm going to leave that one for a bit later because that's more advanced and it comes on to making custom God powers, and that's God power redefine. This allows you to specify an icon, name and rollover for God power, and if you combine this with other triggers that affect how that God power originally behaves, you can essentially create your own custom God powers and have a lot of fun with that. It's more advanced, so I will leave it there for now. I hope that's been of mild use, and unfortunately it's not the perfect system for God powers. We'll come back to redefine later, and I will see you again in the next video.